Sammy.
Hi, Kath.
So nice to have you come and just share some of your information with our weaning moms. I think it's incredibly helpful, and especially this topic that we're going to be talking about, which is weaning and oral development, because there's quite a lot of misinformation about it out there. And I think you can really add some clarity to this topic. Just before we start and before I start launching into all my questions, just give me a bit of your background and what exactly it is that you do.
So I am a qualified speech and language therapist, and I've specialized in pediatric feeding. So that being picky eaters, problem feeders, and pediatric dysphagia. And then I am just finishing my certification as a lactation consultant.
Oh, that's excellent. So you've got all the skills that we need today to answer our questions. Yes, and you and I work quite closely together with fussy eaters and picky eaters, and this is probably one of the very important aspects in weaning to down the line actually help decrease that or at least prevent some fussy eating and picky eating. So I think this is really valuable. So obviously we know that nutritionally there's a really good reason why we need to put babies onto complementary foods and move them off their exclusive milk diet. But can you explain from a developmental point of view, specifically oral development point of view, why a baby needs to move onto solid foods?
So from an oral development point of view, you're transitioning or weaning from your soft, smooth foods to table foods. It gets all those jaw movements, your articulators, your muscles, all of those oral articulators working and strengthening, and also getting that movement happens while you are weaning onto table foods, and that is what's necessary for speech development. So we actually say that weaning and beginning of the solid journey is almost a precursor for the development of speech and all the muscles and the movement that is necessary for speech development.
Oh, that's really interesting. It's lovely how in us humans and in our babies, there's so many things that kind of interlink along the road to development, which is one of the reasons why both you and I love working very multidisciplinary and together as a team, because it's the kind of all works together to create optimal baby that's growing and thriving on all levels.
Yeah, and it's almost all those things that you don't think about, but when you kind of put them all together, you realize, oh, hold on, this makes sense, and you see how every little thing contributes to overall development. It's amazing.
Yeah, it is. It really is. So can you just give us an example and list different textures and how the different textures and the progression of textures actually assist with oral development and swallowing and things like that?
Okay, so obviously the first texture that you start your baby on when your baby is ready to start on solids is your smooth purees. And your smooth purees, you get your typical shop bought super smooth, or it could just be one that of food that you've cooked up at home that you quickly blitz in your NutriBullet, and so that's your starting point for solids. And the reason that we do this is because up until that point, your baby has only actually had milk. So that is basically, that thin liquid is the texture that they are able to cope with. Now we need to slowly start them on their solid journey. And so when we start with smooth purees, we are teaching the baby to move these smooth purees back into their mouth to trigger a swallow. And so where liquid just moves quite freely and quite easily, now this is like a little bit more of a challenge. And so because of the liquid drinking, their tongue moves back and forward in a back forward motion. And that's why often when in the beginning of the solid journey, we see the food comes out the mouth quite a bit. And that's them actually learning what to do with the food and how to transport it back into their mouth to swallow. And then the next texture from there, so with the texture journey, we actually just keep on adding texture to challenge their oral motor skills and development. So your next texture is going to be your thicker, more mashed puree. So basically you're going to take the blender out of the picture and just use a fork or back of a spoon and kind of get that mashed texture. And that's going to teach your baby a little bit more oral motor control. So that's also not going to move so easily to the back of the mouth to trigger a swallow. They're going to have to use their tongue a lot more. They're going to have to get the little pieces out of their gums that are sitting there, and they might even actually start like a bit of a munching pattern. And
So
then at this...
Can I just ask you, and that's very interesting, because I find sometimes moms say to me that they manage, the babies are very happy on the smooth puree, but the minute it becomes a lot more textured with the food that they were used to, they go totally off their food. And so is there another way for those type of babies, your more slow to warm up babies or your sensory sensitive babies? Is there another way that they could still progress with texture, but also keep their nutrition going? So in other words, keep those smooth purees for nutrition, but then would they still be able to develop their oral skills in another way?
Yeah. So I think that's what's really important, is that to see each baby as an individual. So we've got a guideline of textures, and I'm just going to show you a visual over here. So over here we've got, like I was saying, on the left there we've got like your smooth puree, and then there's different degrees of texture. So maybe your little one might not like those middle two textures, but they're happy on the smooth puree, or on the one in the end there, which is a chopped texture. Another visual that I can show you with all the different textures is, for example, here. So we've got like your puree, your lumpy, your mashed, your ground, and then your soft cooked. And some babies will love this puree texture, and they'll get the majority of their meal from a puree, the majority of their nutrition. But what you want to do is still add in these different other textures, but you could always do it as like a snack, or while you're feeding them the puree, then have a little bit of soft cooked pieces on the side, or a little bit of lumpy, just for them to try and get used to the texture, but not to make them eat the bulk of their nutrition from a texture that they don't enjoy. So I like to encourage the exposure of all the textures. But if your baby, let's say, is more sensitive but happy on a certain texture, then make sure they get in the bulk of their nutrition from that texture, but with adding in the other textures, for example, in snacks or little bits in a mealtime. And you want to set up your baby to win. You don't want them to hate eating. You don't want it to be difficult or challenging. You want to give them exposure, but you also want to set them up to win.
No, I like that. And I think that is also so refreshing and almost relieving for a lot of moms, because, I've had a lot of moms come to me and be panicked because their baby eats beautifully, but it's all smooth. Or and now they're wanting to progress the baby, and they think that the baby's never going to learn to talk because they're still on puree. So I like what you're saying about just encouraging other textures outside of the context of possibly mealtime, or that the whole nutritional intake isn't relying on those other textures for nutrition, but more for development. So it's like a dual purpose to the feeding then.
Absolutely. And particularly, like you said, those babies that are sitting on purees, there's other things that we recommend. So something I like is like your hard munchables, which are, purely there for skill refinements and not actually nutrition. So they still get in their jaw and their mouth moving and working, which is what we want and need for speech development, but they get in their bulk of nutrition from their puree, which they're happy with.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I suppose what's also quite fun is that you can include some of those hard munchables and those other textures off your plate of food. So it becomes a bit of also a social interaction. So then your baby is not eating off your plate because they are hungry and they need that nutrition. They're doing it because they are, as you said, exploring their whole kind of skill and reinforcing those skills for oral development, but they're also connecting with you because you are eating and your baby's eating with you.
Absolutely. There's a huge social aspect of eating. And if we think of how we eat, it's always in a social context. And one of our very, very important principles with feeding, and especially with our picky eaters, is parents modeling good eating behaviors. So you want your child to show interest in the food that everyone else at the table is eating, and that's how they learn. Children are visual learners, and they learn from being shown and watching others. So that is very, very important. Yeah.
Okay, and then can you just maybe give us some cases where it doesn't always go right? So what conditions make the feeding journey, and specifically advancing in textures, a little bit more challenging or difficult for some babies?
So like we've mentioned, some babies, if their sensory profile, if they're super, super sensitive, we do tend to see a lot more texture pickiness from those hypersensitive babies. And then more medically, conditions such as cerebral palsy or Down syndrome, that's where we see a bit more motor difficulties, so unable to actually deal with different textures due to poor motor strength or motor weakness. Any other type of neurological conditions, and then also anatomical conditions such as a cleft lip or palate. And then we also have children on the autistic spectrum. Sometimes we see that they can have some either hypersensitivity or hyposensitivity, which does manifest in their feeding, and we see some feeding difficulties with them as well.
Okay, but for your children who are neurotypical and don't have other medical or physical challenges, is there a window period where we should be kind of exposing them to a variety of textures? We find that in nutrition, nutritional food and allergies, and that we want to try and get exposure to all the allergens and as big a variety of tastes and flavors within kind of the first few months of introducing solids, so that by like 10 months they really have been exposed to a lot of nutritional flavors and all the allergens. And is there something like this for textures?
So I would generally say about a year. So you want to have given your baby exposure to the different textures within a year. And the reason being is then, after that, they'll be more accepting of those textures. And studies have found that the later you introduce them, and later than a year, the more at risk you are of your baby actually not accepting that texture. So I would say within a year, definitely.
Okay, so that's great. So moms have got time as well, which is nice. So it's not like within the first month of introducing solids they need all the textures, but it is, be aware of it, be conscious of it, and then find your baby's kind of rhythm and figure out whether they want it as part of their food or whether they want it separate to their nutritional food. And so that really is then very baby dependent. But mom's got time, and I think that in a rushed world, I think that's always a good thing.
Yes.
The last question, just before we end, I just want to, probably a big fear for all moms is choking. And the minute you speak texture and you speak it, and if you like that one slide that you showed us, the one thought is, well, could my baby choke on it? What is your advice? And maybe you can also just differentiate between gagging and choking.
Mm-hmm. So I think that that's very important for parents to know the difference between gagging and choking. So gagging is a very typical occurrence in the weaning journey, and it is likely going to happen often. It's a protective and defense mechanism. And so with babies drinking milk, their gag reflex is really anterior in the mouth. And so with the weaning journey, that actually desensitizes the gag reflex and moves it further back into the mouth. So you're going to see gagging quite a lot in the weaning journey. So it is really important to understand and know the difference between gagging and choking. Obviously, choking episodes are severe, and you need to know what to do in the event that does happen. But you also don't want to jump the gun every time your baby gags, because then you're also going to start getting a reaction from your baby. They're going to learn that they get a reaction from mom and dad. And so it's really important to distinguish between those two. Also, it's important to go at your baby's pace. So you don't want to be introducing your soft solids or your finger foods if your baby isn't actually ready for them. So really use the guidelines and read your baby's cues. You'll know when they're ready to progress to a more solid texture. And then from research, we've actually seen that there's less risk with choking when finger foods are introduced earlier. So I like to say introduce those finger foods alongside the gradual transition of the different textures, but then also be present. So you don't want to leave your baby with a plate of food and go and do things in the kitchen. You actually want to be there next to your baby, watching what they're doing and just making sure that they're eating safely.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important advice, because if you are present and you are there, you can monitor exactly what's going on, and that takes away a lot of the fear as well. I also read something really interesting a while back, and just that babies are I was just reminded again how babies mirror your facial expressions, and they actually learn to eat by watching you eat and watching. They love to fixate on the mouth of their caregiver. And I think that's not done often enough, where we actually eat around our babies and eat kind of in front of our babies. So I think that's also really important when going for textures, that your baby see you eating a banana and eating an apple and things like that, so that they learn that whole chewing and that mouth by observation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much, Sammy. You gave us so many just amazing tips and ideas. And I know you've also put together a lovely just a texture progression chart for us, and we'll make it available to moms. And you've also got your details on there, which is lovely, so that they can just connect with you if they need to. And we've also got your details at the end of this webinar as well. So thanks again, and I'm sure we'll be doing many more with you.